The wind rolled across the desert like a whisper of forgotten stories. It carried dust, sorrow, and the faint scent of rain that rarely came. In that dry corner of Arizona territory where the sun scorched the earth and the coyotes sang at dusk, a young woman sat on the steps of an old wooden chapel, clutching the edge of her faded shawl. Her name was Clara May, and by nightfall, she was to be married to a man she had never spoken to, a man who lay silent in a coma somewhere beyond those chapel walls. The wedding wasn't one born from love or even choice. It was a matter of duty, of promises made between families, long before Clara could understand what such promises meant. Her father had owed a debt, not in money, but in peace. Years ago, the Apaches had spared his life after a raid gone wrong, and in return, he had given his word his daughter would one day unite their bloodlines through marriage. That day had come, though the groom, an Apache warrior known for his courage and silence, had fallen into a deep sleep after a battle that nearly cost him his life. Now the townsfolk whispered that marrying a man who might never wake was madness, but Clara's father's word was law. The old ways of honor didn't bend for the heart's protests. Still deep inside her, something trembled, a mix of fear and strange curiosity. She had seen the warrior only once before his injury. He had stood proud, his dark hair falling over his shoulders, his eyes calm but fierce. There had been something about him, something beyond the lines of his face, as if he carried the spirit of the mountains themselves. The chapel doors creaked open. The preacher stood inside, wiping sweat from his brow, muttering about how the sun seemed hotter on days meant for sorrow. Clara hesitated before stepping in. The air inside was still heavy with candle smoke and tension. At the front lay the man she was to marry, covered with a white blanket, his skin pale from long sleep, his breath shallow but steady. He didn't look dangerous now, only peaceful, as if resting between two worlds. Her father stood beside the preacher, his jaw firm, eyes avoiding hers. He looked older than he did a year ago, worn down by guilt and stubborn pride. Clara wanted to ask him why this had to happen, why her life had to be tied to someone who couldn't even look at her. But she didn't. In that land, questions like that went unanswered. People did what they must to survive, and women bore the weight of those choices quietly. When the vows began, Clara's hands shook. She repeated the words, her voice barely rising above the creak of the floorboards. The preacher's voice trembled too, not out of fear but discomfort. Even he didn't know what to make of this union between a sleeping warrior and a girl barely 20. Outside, thunder rumbled over the hills, and the wind pressed against the chapel walls like it wanted to listen. As the final words of the ceremony faded, the preacher paused. There was one last tradition, one whispered about in both Apache and settler lore, a sealing kiss. It wasn't meant as a romantic gesture, but as a symbol, a bridge between worlds. Clara froze when the preacher mentioned it. How could she kiss a man who didn't even know she existed? But her father's look told her there was no room for refusal. She stepped closer, her heart pounding like hooves across dry earth. The warrior's face was still, his lips pale and motionless. She leaned in, her breath trembling as her lips brushed his, soft and uncertain. The moment stretched silent, strange and sacred. The air seemed to shift. The candles flickered, though there was no wind. She pulled back, startled, her pulse racing. For the briefest second, she thought she saw his eyelids twitch, the faintest movement, like the first ripple in still water. The preacher dismissed it as nerves. Her father said nothing, only led her outside where the wind had turned cooler. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something had stirred in that chapel, something unseen. That night she lay awake, listening to the distant thunder rolling over the desert. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the warrior she now called husband. Days passed. The town returned to its uneasy rhythm. Word spread that the Apache warrior still lived, though his condition hadn't changed. Some said his spirit had wandered, waiting to find its way home. Others whispered that the kiss had bound his soul to hers, for better or worse. Clara tried not to listen, but she couldn't escape the pull of curiosity. Each evening she returned to the small cabin where he rested, watching over him as if drawn by something she couldn't name. She noticed small things first, the way his fingers twitched when she spoke softly. The faint warmth returning to his skin, the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing that grew stronger each night. Sometimes she talked to him about simple things, the smell of rain on dust, the way the sun dipped low behind the red cliffs, the sound of the river that never stopped moving. It was strange, but she found comfort there in that quiet, one-sided conversation. The townsfolk began to talk again, saying she was bewitched or cursed. A few believed she had fallen for the man she was forced to marry. Maybe they were right. She didn't know herself. But she could feel something shifting inside her, like a seed cracking open beneath the earth, waiting for light. She started to dream of him not, as he was now, silent and still, but alive. In her dreams he stood before her in moonlight, his eyes sharp as if he had known her all his life. One night, as the desert slept under a silver sky, Clara sat beside him again, her hand resting near his. A storm was gathering far away, lightning flashing faintly on the horizon. She reached out and brushed a lock of hair from his forehead, whispering words she didn't plan. "If you can hear me, come back." Her voice broke, the weight of everything pressing down on her. The loneliness, the fear, the strange hope she didn't dare name. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, a shiver passed through the air, so faint she almost missed it. His hand twitched. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She leaned closer, watching his chest rise and fall. Another small movement followed, this time stronger, his fingers curling slightly as if reaching for something unseen. Outside, thunder cracked across the sky. The candle by the bedside flickered wildly. Clara gasped, unsure if what she saw was real or just her longing playing tricks on her tired mind. She whispered his name again, softer this time. And that was when his lips parted, a shallow breath escaping like the first sigh of life returning. Fear and wonder tangled inside her. She stood frozen, unable to move or speak. Then his eyes opened, dark and deep as the desert night. For a heartbeat, he simply looked at her, confusion flickering across his face. She could barely breathe, her heart thudding loud enough to fill the room. His gaze held hers, and though no words came, something unspoken passed between them, recognition, or fate, or something older than both. Before she could say a word, his eyes closed again, and his breathing slowed. But it wasn't the stillness of before. It was the calm of someone resting after finding their way back. Clara sat there, trembling, tears blurring her vision. The silence felt alive now, filled with the echo of something beginning. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or whether he would wake again. But she knew that moment had changed everything. The kiss meant more than she ever imagined. It had tied her destiny to his. And now, whatever happened next, she could no longer turn away. Or somewhere deep in that desert night, under a sky of restless stars, the story of a forced marriage had shifted into something far greater, a story of awakening, redemption, and the strange, wild power of love that defies even the silence of sleep. And as dawn crept over the horizon, painting the cliffs in gold, Clara realized her life would never again belong to the world she knew. Something had been set in motion that no one, not her father, not the town, not even fate itself, could stop. Morning sunlight broke over the red cliffs, spilling gold across the land that had known more sorrow than peace. The desert looked quiet, but Clara could feel something moving beneath the stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She hadn't slept all night, her thoughts circling around what she had seen. The memory of his eyes opening haunted her, the dark, deep look that had met hers for only a second, but felt like it had reached into her soul. She told no one. Her father would have called it nonsense, and the preacher might have said it was the devil's trick. The town already whispered too much about her and the strange marriage, so Clara kept the secret tucked inside her heart like a fragile ember, afraid that speaking it aloud might cause it to die out. She spent the morning sweeping the small cabin, fetching water, and pretending life went on as before, though every step she took was careful, as if not to disturb the air where his spirit might still linger awake. The cabin sat near the edge of the hills, half shaded by tall mesquite trees. It had once belonged to a trader who'd gone missing years ago, and now it served as a quiet place for healing or waiting. The Apache warriors people had visited once, days after the wedding, bringing herbs and silent prayers. They left offerings by his bedside, small stones, feathers, and dried sage bundles that filled the air with a bitter, smoky scent. Clara didn't understand all their customs, but she treated them with care. Sometimes she caught herself staring at those small gifts, wondering if they were meant to protect him or warn her. By midday, the sun was fierce again. She sat by the open window, sewing the edge of a worn blanket, her eyes drifting toward the bed. He lay as before, still and pale, but there was something different now. His breathing had a steady rhythm, stronger than the week before. His skin wasn't as colorless. She wondered if it was truly possible that her kiss had stirred him. It seemed foolish to think so, yet deep down she felt that the moment they touched, something invisible had been exchanged between them. She remembered how people had described him before the injury a fierce protector, a leader among his people, a man who carried both pride and pain. His name was said to mean thunder that sleeps, though few dared to speak it aloud. Clara had grown up hearing stories of Apaches, how they moved like shadows through the canyons, how they fought with unmatched skill, and how their spirits were tied to the land. Yet now one of them lay in her care, bound to her by a ceremony neither of them had chosen. That afternoon, a wagon approached, stirring a trail of dust behind it. Clara stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the sun. Her father climbed down, his shoulders slumped, his hat pulled low. He carried a sack of flour and a box of candles. He spoke little as he set them inside. His silence had become heavier since the wedding, and Clara didn't press him with questions. "How is he?" he asked finally, nodding toward the bed. "The same," Clara answered softly, though her heart raced at the lie. Her father looked at the man for a long time, his face unreadable. "You keep doing what you've been told. This was the deal, and we'll see it through." "I know," Clara said. I said. She wanted to ask him if he truly believed in the promise he'd made years ago, but she stopped herself. He had lost too much to the desert already, his land, his pride, his sons. Maybe this was his way of finding forgiveness, even if it cost her happiness. When he left, the silence settled again. The only sounds were the wind against the window and the faint ticking of the clock by the wall. Clara sat down and watched the man's face, tracing the shape of his jaw with her eyes. She noticed the faint scar near his temple, the curve of his lips, the mark on his wrist that looked like an old burn. She wondered what stories his skin held, what memories hid behind that stillness. As the days passed, she found herself drawn to him more deeply. She began reading aloud from the few books she owned, dull tales of the frontier. Poems she barely understood, even letters her mother had once written. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she spoke anyway, her voice filling the lonely room. It made the silence less cruel. Sometimes she imagined what he might say if he woke. Would he be angry to find himself tied to a woman not of his people? Would he even remember what had happened? The thought frightened her. The peace she had found in caring for him might shatter the moment his eyes opened again. Yet at night, when she prayed by his bedside, she found herself wishing for that moment to come soon. One evening, the sky turned red with an approaching storm. Clara went outside to gather the washing before the rain hit. She looked toward the ridge and saw a figure on horseback watching the cabin. Her heart jumped. The rider was tall, wearing Apache clothes, his long hair tied back. She froze, clutching the wet linen in her arms. The man didn't move closer, only lifted his hand in a silent gesture before turning his horse and riding toward the hills. When she returned inside, her pulse hadn't slowed. She knew the Apache people were watching, waiting to see what became of their warrior. Perhaps they didn't trust her, or perhaps they were bound by their own laws, as she was by hers. Either way, she felt the weight of their unseen eyes on her. That night, the storm broke with fierce wind and thunder that shook the roof. The sound made her uneasy, reminding her of the first time she'd seen the warrior alive. He had come to town to trade, proud and tall, standing out among the settlers. There had been trouble then, some men had mocked him, and a fight had followed. Clara had watched from behind the store window as he fought without rage, his movements sure and graceful like the storm itself. She had felt something strange even then, though she'd told no one. The storm raged for hours, and Clara stayed by his side, afraid the roof might give in. She whispered to him, not knowing why, as if her words could calm the thunder. The candles flickered, and the air smelled of rain and burning wick. She reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against his, and she felt a faint tremor so slight, she thought she imagined it. But when she looked closer, she saw his hand twitch again, her breath caught. She leaned forward, eyes wide. His face was calm, yet something stirred beneath the surface, a faint tightening of his jaw, a flicker beneath closed lids. She whispered his name, the one she'd been afraid to say aloud. Tatsi. The syllables felt heavy on her tongue, but they filled the room like a prayer. Lightning flashed outside, and in that light, she saw his eyes open once more. Not fully, but enough to catch the glint of awareness returning. A small sound escaped his lips, rough and broken, like a voice finding its way back through darkness. Clara's heart pounded as she bent closer, barely daring to breathe. He tried to speak, but only managed a whisper she couldn't understand. His gaze found hers, and though it lasted only a second, she felt the weight of 100 questions in it. Then his eyes closed again, his chest rising and falling slowly. But his breathing no longer seemed empty, it carried purpose. Clara sat back, trembling. She didn't know what to do. Should she tell her father? Should she send for the preacher or the medicine woman from the Apache camp? Or should she wait, guarding the secret as she had the first time? The fear of losing that fragile connection made her hesitate. She decided to wait. When dawn came, the storm was gone. The desert glistened with rain, the air cool and clean. Clara stepped outside, watching the light stretch across the hills. She could feel something had changed again, not just in him, but in the air around them. The land felt awake, alive in a way it hadn't before. She returned inside and saw him lying still, his face peaceful, but different somehow. There was color in his cheeks, warmth in his skin. Clara touched his hand again, and this time his fingers moved faintly around hers, a weak but certain grip. She caught her breath, her heart caught between joy and fear. He was coming back slowly, and she knew it. But what that meant, she couldn't guess. When he woke, would he know her? Would he remember the promise that had tied their lives together? Or would he reject her as an outsider who had stolen what belonged to his people? Those questions hung heavy in her chest as she sat beside him, watching the first light spill through the window. Outside, the land stretched endless and quiet, yet it no longer felt empty. Somewhere beyond the hills, his people waited. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the same waiting for the moment that would change everything again. The kiss had stirred his spirit, but what it had awakened between them was only beginning to show its shape. It's like dawn breaking over an uncertain horizon. The sun had barely lifted when Clara heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the ridge. She froze, standing by the doorway of the cabin. 3 riders appeared against the rising light, their figures outlined in gold. She recognized them by their braided hair, their painted horses, and the silence with which they rode. They were Apache. Her heart thudded as she stepped aside to let them pass, but they didn't go by. They stopped right in front of the cabin, their dark eyes fixed on her. The tallest dismounted first. He looked older, his face lined but strong. The others stayed mounted, watching carefully. The older man spoke in a low voice that carried both calm and warning. Clara couldn't understand the words, but the meaning came clear enough from his tone. They wanted to see the one who lay inside. She nodded and stepped aside. The man entered, moving with the quiet grace of someone used to danger. His eyes softened when they found the still figure on the bed. He said something under his breath, a word that sounded like a prayer. Then he turned to Clara. "You care for him?" he asked in broken English. She nodded. "I do what I can." He looked at her for a long time. "You are his wife now?" The question felt heavier than she expected. "By law," she said softly. The man's gaze moved to the small offerings still laid near the bedside, the stones, the feathers, the dried herbs. "These were meant to keep his spirit close," he said. "You did not remove them." "I didn't dare," Clara replied. He gave a short nod. "Good. His name is Tatsi. He is not dead, but his spirit is far from his body. When the white men fought him, he was hurt deeply, not only in flesh, but in heart." He paused, looking at her again. Something happened here. The air feels changed." Clara swallowed. He opened his eyes once, twice maybe. He tried to speak. At that, the man's expression shifted from calm to sharp. He spoke only a little. I didn't understand, but he looked at me, like he knew me. The Apache elder stepped closer to the bed, murmuring something Clara couldn't follow. He placed his hand lightly on Totsi's chest, then closed his eyes. The room fell silent except for the slow rhythm of breathing. Finally, he turned back to her. "He is waking," he said. "But if he wakes too soon, before the spirit is ready, he will not know where he belongs. Not with your people, not with mine." "What should I do?" Clara asked. her voice trembling. "Do nothing," he said. "Only wait. Speak kindly. The spirit listens even when the body cannot answer." Then he turned to leave. Before stepping outside, he looked at her again and added, "When he remembers who he is, he may not remember who you are. Be ready for that." After they left, Clara stood for a long time in the doorway, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. The warning stayed in her mind, heavy and sharp. That evening, her father came again, bringing dried meat and flour. She told him about the Apache visitors, but he grew pale at the mention. "You shouldn't let them near," he said. "If they decide the truce means nothing, they'll come for you too." "They didn't mean harm," Clara said. "They were only checking on him." He slammed the table with his fist. "You're forgetting who you are, girl. You're no Apache. You're my daughter, and you'll not be taking orders from them." His anger filled the room like smoke. Clara wanted to tell him that the world didn't care about the lines he tried to draw, that the land itself belonged to no one. But she stayed silent, knowing words would only feed his fury. He left before sunset, muttering that he'd come back in 2 days with more supplies and that she should be ready to leave if things turned worse. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made her jump. She sat by the bed again, candlelight flickering across Totsy's face. His breathing was calm, but his brow was furrowed, as if caught in some hidden battle. She reached for his hand. "If you can hear me," she whispered, "please come back. But don't forget peace when you do." For a moment, the faintest sound came from his throat, something between a sigh and a whisper. She leaned closer but heard nothing more. The candle burned low. The night pressed heavy and endless around them. The next morning, Clara walked to the stream that ran behind the cabin. She needed the quiet sound of running water to clear her thoughts. The desert was soft after the storm, the air cool and clean. She knelt by the bank, washing her hands, when she heard a twig snap behind her. Turning quickly, she saw a man standing a few paces away, a white man she didn't recognize. He wore a weathered coat, his face half hidden by a hat. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, tipping his hat. "Name's Grant. I'm with the Territorial Patrol." Clara stood slowly, her heart wary. "What do you want?" "I heard some talk down in town," he said. "Folks say you're keeping an Apache alive up here. That true?" She hesitated. "He's my husband," she said firmly, "and he's no danger to anyone." Grant's eyes narrowed. "Funny kind of husband, seeing as how he can't stand or speak." He stepped closer. "You be careful, miss. There are folks who don't like the idea of a settler woman tied to an Apache. Some men think it's an insult to every man who fought in these parts." Clara felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Then those men don't know what honor means." He smiled thinly. "Honor doesn't mean much when fear starts talking. Word is, his people might be gathering again. If he wakes, if he remembers, you might be caught in the middle." She didn't answer. Grant tipped his hat again, though his eyes stayed cold. "You ever see anything strange? You let the patrol know. We'll handle it." Then he turned and rode off, leaving a trail of dust that lingered long after he was gone. Clara stood by the stream, her hands trembling. The world around her felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. She knew how quickly fear turned into violence in these parts. And now, she was standing between two worlds that could collide at any moment. When she returned to the cabin, Totsy was restless. His head moved slightly and faint sounds escaped his throat. She rushed to his side, calling his name. His eyelids fluttered, and for a moment his eyes opened again, clearer this time. He stared at her, confusion and pain flickering across his face. "You're safe," she whispered. "It's your home." He didn't respond, only turned his head weakly, as if searching for something that wasn't there. Then, with effort, he spoke a single word in his own tongue. Clara didn't understand, but the sound of it filled her with both relief and unease. Afterward, he drifted back into sleep. Clara sat beside him, trying to remember the word. It sounded like Nada. She whispered it to herself over and over, hoping to find its meaning. The next few days passed in uneasy quiet. The town grew restless. Riders had been seen near the river, some said Apache scouts. Others claimed bandits. Clara's father came again, this time with fear in his eyes. "We need to leave," he said. "They're saying war might start again. The patrol's calling for all settlers to move closer to Fort Lowell." Clara refused. "Can't be moved, not yet." Her father's face hardened. You'd risk your life for him, for someone who might never wake? He ain't one of us, Clara. He never will be. She met his gaze steadily. Maybe that's why I have to stay. He stared at her for a long moment, then turned away, his anger unable to hide the hurt beneath it. You sound like your mother, he said quietly. She believed in things that didn't belong to this world either. Then he left without another word. That night, the wind howled across the plain. Clara sat by the fire, thinking about her mother, a woman who had loved stories of old spirits, who had once told Clara that the land remembered every promise ever made upon it. Maybe that was why she felt bound to this man she hardly knew. It wasn't just duty. It was something the land itself had demanded. Near midnight, she heard movement. Turning sharply, she saw Totsy's hand gripping the blanket, his face tense. Hurried to him, whispering his name. His eyes opened wide this time, filled with something fierce and lost. His voice was hoarse but clear enough for her to understand 2 words. Where am I? Clara's breath caught. She tried to calm him, but he pushed himself weakly upright, looking around the room like a trapped animal. You're safe, she said quickly. You were hurt. You're home now. But the look in his eyes told her he didn't believe her. His gaze darted to the doorway, to the window, to the feathers and stones still resting by his bed. He looked at her again, confusion giving way to something sharper. Who are you? He whispered. Clara froze, unable to answer. The air in the cabin felt heavy again, thick with all the words she couldn't find. She had waited for him to wake, prayed for it, dreamed of it to end. Now that he was truly awake, she realized nothing would ever be simple again. Outside, the wind carried a low hum through the desert, like the warning cry of something ancient stirring. Inside, 2 worlds finally met, one waking, one waiting, and neither ready for what came next. Taz's eyes stayed fixed on her, sharp and uncertain. The cabin felt smaller with him awake, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Clara took a careful step forward, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. The air between them felt thick with things neither could explain. He looked around, his gaze moving from the old wooden beams to the flickering candlelight, then back to her face. His body trembled slightly, weakened by days without movement, but his spirit was awake now. She could see it in his eyes. You were hurt, she said softly, her voice shaking. You've been asleep for a long time. The fighting is over now. You're safe here. His brow furrowed, as if her words were pieces of a puzzle he couldn't fit together. Safe, he repeated, his voice rough from disuse. Where is this place? It's my home, Clara said. Near the hills, west of the town. At the mention of town, his face darkened. He turned away, staring at the floor. I remember fire, he whispered. Gunsmoke. My brothers. His hand clenched weakly around the blanket. They were taken. Clara's heart ached at his tone. The war is over, she said carefully. No one's fighting anymore. He looked back at her, his eyes searching. Why am I here? You are not one of my people. She hesitated. How could she explain the strange twist of fate that had made them husband and wife? The marriage that had begun as duty, a promise sealed by others' choices, now hung between them like an unspoken question. You were dying, she said finally. The elders brought you here. There was a promise. Union meant to bring peace between your people and mine. He stared at her, confusion giving way to disbelief. You were saying I was forced into this. Clara swallowed hard. So was I. The silence that followed was heavy. Totsy leaned back against the pillow, his breathing uneven. She could tell the truth unsettled him as much as it did her. He looked out the window, where the last light of evening painted the sky in shades of red and gold. My people will come, he said after a while. They will not leave me here. I know, Clara said. They came once already. He turned sharply toward her. When days ago, they said you were between worlds. They told me to keep you safe until your spirit returned. Totsy's expression softened for a moment, then grew distant again. You should have let me die. Clara felt the words like a knife. I couldn't, she said quietly. What? After everything that's happened. You're meant to live. He didn't reply, but his eyes lingered on her face a little longer this time, as if seeing something beyond the surface. She busied herself with the fire, pretending not to notice. The night deepened, and outside the coyotes began to howl. The next morning she found him sitting up for the first time, his back against the wall. The effort had clearly cost him strength, but his gaze was steady. She brought him water and a bowl of broth. He accepted them, without a word, his movements slow but sure. As the day went on, he began to ask questions. Wanted to know how long he had been asleep, what had become of his people, and who controlled the land now. Clara answered as best she could, though each answer seemed to harden something inside him. When she told him about the patrols, the watchtowers, and the new laws pushed across the land, his jaw tightened. They took everything, he said quietly. And now they take peace and call it mercy. Clara wanted to comfort him, but she knew her words would sound empty. The world's changing, she said instead. Maybe too fast for anyone to understand. Later that evening, while she fetched water from the stream, she saw a flicker of movement among the trees. A man's shadow, there and gone again. Her heart jumped. She set down the bucket and listened. The only sound was the wind, but the feeling of being watched stayed with her all the way back to the cabin. Tatsi noticed her pale face as soon as she entered. What happened? Nothing, she said quickly. I just thought I saw someone. His eyes narrowed. Soldiers. Maybe, I'm not sure. He pushed the blanket aside and swung his legs over the edge of the bed, his face tightening with pain. You should not be alone here, he said. If they find me, you're not ready to move, she said, going to his side. You need to rest. But he shook his head. If they find me, they will not let me live. They will call me a threat, even as I lie here. Clara didn't argue. She knew he was right. The patrol officer, Grant, had already made his suspicion clear. If he discovered that Tatsi was awake, there would be trouble worse than either of them could handle. That night, the unease grew stronger. Tatsi slept lightly, his body tense even in rest. Clara sat by the window, staring out at the moonlit desert. Every few minutes, she thought she heard something outside, the rustle of leaves, a faint snap of branches. She wanted to believe it was only the wind, but deep down she knew it wasn't. Near midnight, she heard the sound of a horse. Not one, but several. She jumped to her feet and moved to the window. 3 riders again, moving in silence, their silhouettes barely visible. For a moment her heart lifted. It might be the Apaches come to take Totsi home. But then she saw the glint of metal in the moonlight. Rifles. She ran to Totsi and shook his shoulder gently. Wake up. Someone's coming. He was on his feet in an instant, despite the weakness still in him. His instincts had returned faster than his strength. How many? 3, maybe more, she whispered, coming from the ridge. He reached for the knife she kept near the hearth and checked its edge. You must go, he said. If they are soldiers, they will not hesitate. I'm not leaving you, Clara said firmly. You don't understand, he said, his voice low and urgent. If they find you with me, they'll call you traitor. Before she could answer, a sharp knock came at the door.
Ow!
The sound froze them both. Then a voice called out, a voice she recognized. Miss Clara. You awake in there? It was Grant. Her stomach turned cold. She glanced at Tatsi, who had moved silently toward the shadows, his knife still in hand. Clara stepped to the door and tried to steady her voice. What is it? Sorry to trouble you, Grant said. We've had reports of Apache scouts nearby. Need to check your place. Make sure everything's safe. Clara hesitated. There's no one here but me, she said. Mind if I take a look? His tone was polite, but beneath it, she heard the threat. Shh. She opened the door a crack, forcing a smile. It's late, officer. Grant pushed the door wider. Won't take long. He stepped inside without waiting for her permission. 2 other men followed, rifles slung over their shoulders. They scanned the small cabin, their eyes sharp. Clara's heart hammered so loudly she was sure they could hear it. Grant walked slowly toward the bed, still rumpled from where Totsi had been lying earlier. He brushed his hand over the blanket. You've had company, he said. Someone's been here. Clara swallowed hard. My father visits sometimes. Your father's got a ranch 20 miles east, Grant said. He wouldn't ride out this far at night. Tatsi moved silently behind the wooden partition, hidden by the shadows. Clara stepped closer to Grant, blocking his view. You've done your duty, she said quickly. Now please let me rest. Grant studied her face for a long moment. Then he smiled faintly. You've got a brave heart, miss, but you'd best not let it get you killed. He nodded to his men, and they turned toward the door. Relief rushed through Clara like air after drowning. But just as they reached the threshold, A faint sound broke the silence, a creak of wood from where Tatsi shifted his weight. Grant's head snapped around. What was that? Before Clara could answer, he strode to the back of the cabin and yanked aside the partition. His hand went for his pistol. Well, now, he said softly, look what we have here. Everything happened at once, Clara shouted, lunging forward to grab his arm. The lamp by the bed tipped over, crashing to the floor and spilling flame. One of the other soldiers cursed and swung his rifle toward the shadows. Tatsi moved with startling speed for a man who had barely been able to stand hours ago. Caught Grant's wrist, twisting the pistol away. The two struggled, the firelight flashing across their faces. Clara tried to pull the burning cloth away before the flame spread. Outside, the horses whinnied and stamped. Inside, the small cabin filled with smoke and chaos. Grant shouted to his men, "Take him down," but Tatsi shoved him back, the pistol clattering to the floor. For a heartbeat, the two men locked eyes, Grant with cold fury, Tatsi with defiant strength. Then Tatsi grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her toward the door. They burst outside into the night air, the wind tearing at their clothes. Behind them, the fire spread quickly, devouring the cabin walls. The soldiers scrambled after them, shouting orders. Clara's breath came fast, fear and smoke burning her lungs. Tatsi pulled her toward the trees, his steps uneven but determined. "This way," he said, his voice low and fierce. "Can't go back." The desert stretched before them, dark and endless, the sky full of stars that offered no comfort. Behind them, the glow of the burning cabin flickered like a warning. The life they had known was gone, consumed by the fire and the lies that had bound them. And ahead lay the unknown as people, her past, and the truth that would decide both their fates. The war they thought was over had just begun again. And now there was no turning back. The desert night felt alive as they ran, the sand soft beneath their feet and the stars stretching endless above them. Clara could hear her own heart beat louder than the wind, every breath sharp with smoke and fear. Behind them, the flames from the cabin still rose high, painting the horizon in trembling orange light. That home, small and simple as it was, had been her world. Now it was gone, swallowed by fire and the choices that could no longer be undone. Tatsi stumbled once, catching himself against a boulder, his breath ragged. He was still weak, his wound reopened during the fight, but his eyes burned with something stronger than pain. "We have to keep moving," he said quietly. "They'll follow our tracks by sunrise." Clara nodded, though her legs ached. "Where will we go?" North, he said, glancing toward the distant ridges. "There are old trails only my people know. If we reach them before dawn, we'll be safe." The hours that followed blurred into a long stretch of silence and wind. The world around them was vast and wild, full of hidden sounds, the cry of a hawk, the whisper of the river below the cliffs, the soft rustle of dry grass. Lara had never known the desert this way, not as something empty, but alive, full of secrets and meaning. She followed Tatsi's lead, trusting his instincts more than her fear. By the time the first pale light touched the horizon, they reached the shelter of a canyon. The walls rose high on both sides, painted with old marking signs of people who had once lived and prayed there. Tatsi stopped to catch his breath, his body trembling with exhaustion. Clara helped him sit beside a rock and tore a strip from her shawl to press against his shoulder wound. "You shouldn't have come back for me," he said quietly, his eyes on the rising sun. "They'll think you're one of us now." "I don't care what they think," she said. "I couldn't leave you to die." He looked at her, the corners of his mouth softening. "Saved me once, now you've done it again. But saving me will cost you everything you knew." Clara looked out over the vast land stretching before them. "Everything I knew wasn't worth keeping," she said softly. "I thought peace could be built with rules and promises, but I see now it takes more than that. It takes people willing to stand between two sides, even when neither wants them." Tatsi was silent for a while, watching the lights spread over the canyon walls. "My people will come," he said finally. "If they find us, they may not trust you at first. But I will speak for you." That promise settled between them like a fragile thread. By midday, they heard distant hoofbeats again. Clara's heart jumped, but Tatsi motioned for her to stay low. They watched from behind the rocks as 4 riders passed along the ridge, their uniforms catching the sunlight. Grant was among them, his face hard and set. He stopped for a moment, scanning the valley below. Clara could almost feel his anger, the humiliation of losing them, and the determination that burned even stronger now. But then the riders turned south, disappearing into the haze. When they were gone, Clara let out a long breath. "They won't stop," she whispered. "No," Tatsi said. "But they'll follow the wrong trail. I think we're heading east." He smiled faintly, and for the first time since the fire, she felt a flicker of hope. Over the next few days, they moved carefully, resting by streams and sleeping in the shade of rocks. Tatsi grew stronger, though the wound still slowed him. Clara learned how to find water from the cactus, how to read the wind for signs of danger. Each small lesson felt like a bridge between two worlds that had always been kept apart. On the third evening, they saw smoke in the distance, thin and steady, the kind made by a campfire. Totsi's expression changed. "That's them," he said quietly, "my people." Clara followed him through the narrow pass until they reached a small clearing. Figures stood around the fire, dressed in skins and feathers, their faces solemn. When they saw Tatsi, they came forward quickly, speaking in their language, touching his arms, their relief clear. Then their eyes turned to Clara. She stood still, unsure what to do. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Tatsi spoke to them, his voice calm but firm. They listened, their expressions shifting from suspicion to quiet understanding. One of the older men nodded and stepped forward, placing a hand over his heart, then extending it toward her. Tatsi turned to her. "They say you are welcome here," he said softly. "They call you Naylan, the one who walks between." Clara felt tears burn her eyes. She bowed her head slightly. "Tell them I am honored." The camp that night was peaceful, the stars brighter than she had ever seen. Around the fire, stories were told, of battles survived, of people lost, and of the uncertain future waiting beyond the horizon. Clara listened, understanding only parts of the language, but feeling the meaning in their voices. These were not just tales of war. I think they're stories of survival, of memory, of holding on to something deeper than land or victory. Later, as the fire burned low, Tatsi sat beside her. "You can stay here," he said quietly. "My people will protect you. You would have a home." She looked at him for a long moment. "And you?" "I must return," he said. "There are others still out there, wandering, hiding. They need to know the war is truly over. If we do not tell them, it will never end." She felt the weight of his words. "You'll come back?"
What?
He gave a small smile. "If the wind allows." The next morning, before he left, he gave her a small carved token made of bone. "For when you need to remember who you are," he said. When he rode away with the others, Clara stood watching until they disappeared beyond the ridge. The desert stretched wide and quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. She looked at the token in her hand, and then at the sky. She didn't know what her future would hold, but for the first time in her life, she didn't feel trapped by it. Weeks passed, and the land began to heal. The soldiers stopped coming so often. Rumors spread that the fighting was truly finished, that the last camps had disbanded. Clara found work helping to build a small school near the settlement, a place where both settlers and native children could learn together. It wasn't easy. Some people resisted the idea, but she saw in their faces the same uncertainty she once felt, and she met it with patience. Sometimes at dusk, she would walk to the edge of the hills, where the wind carried the scent of sage and rain. She would look north and imagine Tatsi there, riding through the open land, his spirit unbroken. She didn't know if she would ever see him again, but she believed in what they had both learned, that peace isn't a single moment won in battle, but a long road that begins when two people choose understanding over fear. The seasons turned, and the land slowly changed with them. Wildflowers bloomed where fire had burned, and the river ran clear again after the spring rains. One evening, as she sat outside the schoolhouse, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Your teaching has reached far," Tatsi said, standing in the fading light. Clara turned, her breath catching. He looked stronger, older somehow, but his eyes were the same. She smiled. "You came back, I promised," he said simply. They stood together in silence for a while, watching the sun dip below the horizon. There was no need for grand words. The world around them had shifted, and so had they. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quiet. "There will still be people who do not understand. There always will be," Clara said. "But we keep trying anyway." He nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "That is enough." As the night settled over the land, the stars appeared one by one, bright and steady. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its song rising and fading across the valley. Clara listened, feeling the peace she had once thought impossible. The story of an Apache warrior and a settler woman was never meant to be simple. It was a story of loss and hope, of fire and renewal, of two people who found each other in the space between war and healing. And though the world around them would keep changing, one truth remained: the heart finds strength not in where it belongs, but in what it chooses to stand for. And under that vast, endless sky, Clara and Tatsi stood together, two souls bound by courage, forgiveness, and the quiet promise of a new beginning.